Welcome! Today I'll show you how to inlay, adding visual interest to virtually any project. Join me! Hi, I'm Sean. Welcome to Spunjin. This is the footboard for a bed that I'm making. The style is influenced from a trip to China my wife and I made 2 years ago to adopt our daughter. While we were there, we looked at a lot of artwork, and our favorite pieces had a lot of Chinese cherry blossoms in them. So when we got home, we decided we would incorporate that look into our daughter's bedroom set. Let me show you a little bit about this inlay. The dark bent stems of ebony, walnut, and wangi, contrasted with the bright blossoms of pink ivory and red heart, stands out beautifully against the mahogany, adding visual interest to this piece of furniture. This process is really quite simple, so let's begin by showing you what I used to create this inlay. To start, you'll need material for the inlay. For the petals, I'm using pink ivory from a spindle blank that I sliced into thin strips at the bandsaw. For darker petals, I chose red heart, also from a spindle blank. For the stems, I want to use a few different species of wood. Walnut's a good choice for the lighter areas. For the darker parts, I'm going to go with a darker option, wangi. You could use thin sliced commercial veneer, but it's quite thin and you run the risk of sanding through the veneer when preparing for the finish. I chose to slice my own thickness from a small portion of wangi and even some ebony for more contrast. Last, for more color and detail, I'll use some yellow trans-tint dye in epoxy to make the stamen of the blossoms. The rest of the materials needed include, but are not limited to, the following: an electric burner with a pot of sand for sand shading pieces for shadow detail, a drawing to work from, tracing paper, masking tape, carbon paper and a pencil, a fret or coping saw with a 1/0 blade, a card scraper, a small straight router bit, this one is 1/16 inch diameter, a set of hobby knives, a block for pressing the pieces into place, glue, a mallet, and wax paper. The first step is to mark the artwork and tape it into place. Marking it allows you to reposition it as needed. I chose a spot in the art that will represent a light source. That way the areas closer to the right will be lighter and the areas to the left will be darker. Now determine which piece will be placed first. Keep in mind that the pieces you put in first will ultimately be in the background of the inlay, as successive pieces will overlap, causing a layered effect. With the carbon paper under the tracing paper, I draw the shape of the branch on the ebony. Over at the joinery bench, I clamp a bird's mouth fixture in the vise, place the workpiece over the opening, and saw out the shape with the fret saw. Keep the saw in one position as you saw and move the work with the other hand. I hold the saw at about a 5-degree angle, such that the bevel is toward the inside of the piece. This allows the piece to wedge itself into place for a tight, gap-free fit. Focus on sawing with long strokes on the straighter lines and shorter, faster strokes to make tight turns. With a piece of double-sided tape adhered to the back of the workpiece, position it into place and press it onto the surface. Using a fine tip and the hobby knife, trace the shape, keeping the knife as close to vertical as possible. If you tilt it too much off vertical, you may trace the recess too small or too big. Then loosen the tape and gently remove the workpiece, being careful not to break it. I use a heavier blade next to deepen the lines so routing is easier to see. To set up the router, first plunge the bit to the work surface, place the actual workpiece between the turret stop, and drop the depth stop bar to pinch the workpiece. Remove the piece and then use the micro adjust to make the depth of cut about a 32nd inch shallower than needed. This leaves the piece proud of the surface so it can be trimmed flush later. Now plunge the bit into the work area and with your hands planted on the work surface, use your fingers to guide the router. This allows for much more control than moving the router by its handles. This operation requires close proximity to a working bit, so use caution, wear protective equipment such as eyeglasses and earphones. When the piece fits properly, apply a little glue, then press the piece into position. Cover with wax paper and use a block and mallet to tap the piece into the recess. To press it in further, use a block covered with packing tape and clamp it firmly. When the block is removed, it should look something like this. To flush it to the surface, I set the router close to the surface and use the bit to plane it flat. You could use a block plane or just go at it with sandpaper. This also creates fine dust to mix with the glue to fill in any gaps that may have occurred. Then sand and move on to the next piece following the same steps. It's just rinse and repeat 60-some times. To create a shadow effect, I use a hot plate to heat play sand in a pot. The piece is placed into the sand and allowed to char until a desired darkness is reached. This process darkens the wood all the way through, but also shrinks the workpiece. So sand shade first before the routing process for a tighter fit. Here's a tip for inlaying fine lines. Using a hobby knife with a heavy blade, score the lines deep into the surface. Cover the area with masking tape, and rub the surface with a pencil to locate the knifed lines. Then use the knife once more to cut through the tape. Use a slow setting epoxy, such as West Systems epoxy, and add a couple drops of dark brown dye, or even India ink. Use a brush to press the epoxy into the knife lines, and wait until it has fully cured. Then scrape the cured epoxy with a scraper and remove the tape. The result is a fine dark line that somewhat resembles a thin twig. Now to the petals. Again, using the fret saw, I follow the petal outline, keeping the saw at a slight angle and using short strokes as I turn the workpiece. Notice that the base of the petal has a darker grain. This is intentional as it will simulate a slight shadow inside of the blossom. No need to sandshade. You can see how holding the saw at an angle creates the bevel on the edges of the petal. This also keeps the petal from falling out of the slot and disappearing on the sawdust-covered floor. Place the piece into position, turn the router on, plunge down, carefully route the waste away. You'll notice when the bit approaches the knifed line, the material will pop out of the waste area. That means you've gone far enough. Hold the base steady, turn the router off, raise the bit, and remove the router. Then clean the dust from the inside corners using a utility knife and set the piece as before. To add a little more detail, I thought using a small drill bit would make an interesting mark for the blossom stamen. Just place the drill tip near the center of the blossom and strike the end with a hammer to get the hourglass shape. You can use an awl to achieve a more symmetric look as well. Once all the marks have been made, proceed as before with the tape and tinted epoxy. The result is a level of detail that cannot be attained with wood alone. You can see how the addition of an inlay like this makes a piece of furniture even more striking than the style and design alone. The combination of the lighter pink ivory with the darker red heart brings life and light to the artistic inlay. For another great video on this process, check out Mark Spagnolo's video, Router-Based Inlay, at thewoodwhisperer.com. Mark discusses and demonstrates this process in great detail. I hope I've inspired you to try something new in your shop. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it on social media. Also consider subscribing for more project videos just like this. Thanks for watching. I'm Sean. See you next time on Spunjin Works. Keep up with current projects, follow me on Twitter and Instagram. And for even more news and projects, go to spunjinworks.com. Thanks for watching.